If you're stressed and someone tells you to just, take a deep breath to calm down, you might actually be triggering a neurological panic attack.
Yeah, which is completely backwards to everything we've ever been taught about relaxation, right?
Right. I mean, we hear it all the time. It's basically the universal bumper sticker for stress management. Just take a deep breath.
Exactly.
But today, we're doing a deep dive into this massive stack of intracranial EEG studies,
Yeah.
plus some really intense behavioral neuroscience papers. And they prove that trying to process your emotions while you exhale is literally biologically suffocating your brain.
It really is. The stakes here are entirely physiological. We aren't, looking at relaxation techniques or spa day mindfulness here.
No, definitely not. We're looking at a deeply physiological roadmap known as inhale labeling, right?
Right. We are analyzing the hard mechanics of how the human brain processes distress at the neurological level.
And the central thesis across all these sources is that syncing your inner voice with your breathing mechanics can hack your brain's emotional centers.
Hmm.
But only if you execute the steps in the exact right biological sequence.
That sequence is everything. By the end of this deep dive, you are going to understand this step-by-step biological system. It's a way to catch negative emotions, hack the cognitive loops that sustain them, and basically convert that suffocating discomfort into forward-moving physical action.
Which sounds amazing. But to get there, we really have to look at what happens in the body when we stress think. I mean, the friction between your respiratory system and your cognitive load.
Yeah, that friction is the root of the problem.
So let's say I'm stuck in traffic. I'm chewing on some vague frustration, maybe muttering under my breath about a deadline.
Yeah.
What is the actual physiological process driving that internal monologue?
So the underlying mechanism there is something called subvocalization.
Subvocalization, okay.
Right. When humans experience those wordless, murky emotions, that heavy, unformed anxiety we all get, we instinctively attempt to categorize it through self-dialogue. We run an internal narrative.
Like we're trying to talk ourselves through it, even if we aren't saying words out loud.
Exactly. But this process isn't just some abstract phenomenon happening like ethereally in the mind. It is a highly demanding physical action.
But really, just thinking is a physical action.
Oh, absolutely. Subvocalization involves continuous micro-muscle movements in your larynx, your vocal cords, and your tongue.
Wow.
Yeah, your brain is transmitting electrical signals to your throat muscles that are identical to those used for outer speech. They're just at a sub-threshold level for sound production.
So my body is actually gearing up to speak, but I'm just holding the sound back.
Exactly. In fact, electromyography can actually pick up those microcontractions in the throat even when our lips are completely closed.
That is wild. So the brain doesn't distinguish between thinking a sentence and preparing to speak it out loud?
It doesn't. Which is precisely why this engages the phonological loop within your working memory. The brain utilizes this articulatory rehearsal process to handle complex cognitive tasks.
Okay, so when you attempt to logic your way through a sudden anxiety spike, you're firing up this massive network.
Right. You are firing up the entire neurological and muscular machinery required for speech, just to internally talk it out.
And I imagine all that machinery requires a lot of metabolic energy.
Huge amounts of it. But where this gets really complicated is how that cognitive machinery interacts with your biological state of stress.
Right, because we already know the sympathetic nervous system drastically alters respiration when we're stressed.
It completely restricts it. Your breathing becomes shallow, it gets rapid, and it shifts up to the upper chest.
We've all felt that tight chest feeling.
Yeah. Now, superimpose subvocalization over that restricted breathing pattern. When you process feelings, when you're internally narrating your stress, you unconsciously adopt the respiratory cadence of normal, audible speech.
Wait, meaning we do it on the exhale?
Exactly. Humans speak on the exhale. So you are demanding that your nervous system execute complex internal dialogue while actively pushing air out of the lungs.
Pushing air out of lungs that are already underfilled because of the sympathetic nervous system response.
Yes, and that is the physiological conflict the literature calls the exhale trap.
The exhale trap. That sounds awful.
It is. Let's look at the mechanical toll it takes. Subvocalizing on an exhale physically depresses the rib cage and restricts the downward excursion of the diaphragm.
You're basically locking up your main breathing muscle.
Right. And in a state of sympathetic arousal, this significantly reduces your tidal volume. That's the total amount of air exchanged in a single respiratory cycle.
So the diaphragm locks up, your tidal volume plummets, and we induce localized hypoxia. A lack of oxygen.
Hypoxia accompanied by a hypercapnia, which is a rapid buildup of carbon dioxide in the bloodstream.
Oh, because you aren't exchanging air efficiently during this long, stressed-out exhale.
Exactly. The CO2 accumulates, and the brain is exquisitely sensitive to partial pressure changes in CO2.
How does the brain know, though?
There are these central chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata. They detect this buildup and transmit an overwhelming distress signal to the brainstem's respiratory center.
So the brainstem gets this signal, but it doesn't interpret it as psychological stress from traffic or a deadline, right?
No, not at all. It interprets this as an acute survival threat. It reads the data as asphyxiation.
Wow. So the very act of trying to think through the problem creates the physical sensation of breathlessness.
Yep. Which the brainstem then feeds back into the anxiety loop as literal proof that we are in danger.
That is a vicious cycle. The cognitive effort to resolve the stress directly antagonizes your biological state.
It really does. You are demanding high-level processing from the prefrontal cortex while actively depriving it of the metabolic resources required to function, all while triggering primitive survival alarms in the brainstem.
You know what it sounds like? It's like trying to run a massive system-critical software update on a laptop that isn't plugged into a power source.
That's a perfect analogy.
Right. Like the heavy data processing actively drains the remaining battery, which in this case is the oxygen. And instead of the update patching the glitch, the system just overheats.
Yeah, it triggers an emergency shutdown because it lacks the metabolic energy to execute the code.
And the sources are really unequivocal on this physiological bottleneck.
Yeah.
Trying to logic my way out of anxiety is physically suffocating me if I do it while breathing out.
It is. The mental act of subvocalizing on the exhale while in a sympathetic state causes severe laryngeal strain. Your throat muscles are contracting against a diminished column of air.
Which explains so much. Is this why we get jaw tension and headaches when we're stressed?
Yes. This is the exact mechanical origin of the jaw tension and tension headaches, so frequently associated with acute stress.
Okay, so if the exhale is biologically hostile to processing stress, we have to look for another option. And obviously, we can't manually override our heart rate or our digestion just by thinking about it.
No, but respiration is the one autonomic function with a manual somatic override. You can choose to take control of it.
Right, so we have to leverage the inhalation phase.
Exactly. Respiration bridges the autonomic and somatic nervous systems. The core protocol of this research, which is called inhale labeling, relies entirely on shifting your cognitive load to the inhalation phase.
So when that unformed anxiety spikes, instead of exhaling into a subvocalized panic, you initiate a slow, deep inhalation.
Yes, and you confine the internal monologue strictly to the period of lung expansion.
I see. Because expanding the chest and drawing air in while structuring the thought prevents the larynx from clamping down.
Precisely. It eliminates that muscular friction we were just talking about, but more importantly, it facilitates ATP synthesis.
Energy production for the cells.
Right. Focused inhalation delivers a massive oxygen payload to the cerebral cortex. You are restoring the metabolic currency required by the prefrontal cortex to process logic.
And you need that for the hippocampus to contextualize memory too, right?
Exactly. You are providing the actual biological infrastructure necessary for emotional regulation.
But the sources stress a really critical mechanical requirement for this inhalation. And this blew my mind. It cannot be mouth breathing.
Absolutely not. The air must route through the nasal passages to achieve the desired neurological effect. Nasal airflow is completely non-negotiable here.
Why is that? What's so special about the nose?
The underlying neuroscience is remarkable. When air flows through the nasal cavity, it creates mechanical friction against the nasal mucosa.
The lining of the nose.
Right. This physical stimulation activates mechanoreceptors that transmit rhythmic electrical impulses directly to the olfactory bulb.
Wait, the olfactory bulb, isn't that just for smelling?
Typically, yes, it's associated with olfaction. But in this context, the olfactory bulb functions as a powerful neurological pacemaker.
A pacemaker for the brain. That's incredible.
It generates what we call local field potentials, or LFPs. It essentially broadcasts an electrical rhythm across the brain.
And it broadcasts specifically into the limbic system, right? The emotional center.
Yes. During the inhalation phase, this pacemaker effect dictates the electrical oscillations of both the amygdala, your primary threat evaluator, and the hippocampus.
So they sync up.
They do. The intracranial EEG studies cited in the sources demonstrate this perfectly. These studies utilize electrodes implanted directly into the brain tissue for unparalleled spatial and temporal resolution.
Which means we aren't just guessing based on scalp sensors. We are seeing the exact electrical firing in real time.
Exactly. And these structures literally entrain their neural firing to the rhythm of nasal breathing.
So the physical passage of air over the mucosa acts as the conductor for the limbic system.
That's a great way to put it. The synchronization peaks exclusively during the nasal inhale. The IEG data shows this entrainment degrades significantly during the exhale.
And what if you breathe through your mouth?
The synchronization vanishes entirely.
That is a massive realization. If someone is mouth breathing during a panic response, they are completely bypassing the nasal mucosa.
Yes. The olfactory bulb remains dormant, the LFPs fail to synchronize the amygdala and hippocampus, and the brain loses its optimal processing rhythm.
Does this mean if I'm a mouth breather when I'm stressed, I'm literally missing the biological window to understand my own feelings?
Yes, you are biologically handicapping your emotional regulation. And behavioral science corroborates this intracranial data through studies on something called the sensory sampling window.
The sensory sampling window. What is that?
Researchers have demonstrated that humans process visual stimuli with significantly greater speed and accuracy during nasal inhalation compared to exhalation,
Like what kind of stimuli?
specifically identifying fearful or threatening facial expressions.
Oh, wow. So the brain is actively optimizing its data acquisition during the inhale. The sensory radar is calibrated to maximum sensitivity.
Exactly. By synchronizing your internal monologue with a deep nasal inhale, you are capitalizing on this high-fidelity sampling window.
You're utilizing the optimized state of the hippocampus and amygdala to precisely examine that formless discomfort.
Right. You are forcing the brain to evaluate the emotion at the exact millisecond. Its architecture is most capable of handling the data.
Okay, so the nasal inhale establishes the foundation. The amygdala and hippocampus are synchronized, ATP is being synthesized, and the sensory sampling window is wide open.
The structural integrity of the network is pristine at that exact moment.
Right. But what is the actual cognitive input during this window? Like, what am I supposed to be thinking about while I'm breathing in?
This transitions into the psychological execution phase. With the brain primed to scan the emotion, you must explicitly categorize it.
Categorize it how?
In clinical psychiatry, this mechanism is termed affect labeling.
Affect labeling. So literally just naming the specific emotion, like articulating to yourself, this is resentment or this is acute performance anxiety.
Exactly. It is a targeted cognitive intervention. Functional MRI data reveals that affect labeling goes far beyond mere description. It's not just a passive observation.
What's it doing structurally?
Naming an emotion engages the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, the RVLPFC. This region serves as a sophisticated cognitive braking system.
A braking system for your emotions. So when the RVLPFC activates, it routes a signal through the medial prefrontal cortex down into the limbic system, right?
Yes, it transmits a direct suppression order to the amygdala. The fMRI scans demonstrate that the moment an individual successfully applies an accurate affect label, amygdala activation plummets by up to 50%.
A 50% reduction in your threat response simply from linguistic categorization. That's insane.
It's extremely powerful. And because the amygdala is the master switch for sympathetic arousal, that suppression cascades down the autonomic nervous system.
Right, so your heart rate decelerates, your skin conductance normalizes, meaning you stop sweating so much, and the physiological panic just recedes.
Exactly.
But why does just putting a word to a feeling possess that much inhibitory power over such a primitive survival structure?
It comes down to how the amygdala works. The amygdala is designed to prioritize the mitigation of uncertainty over the mitigation of known danger.
Wait, say that again. Uncertainty is worse than known danger.
To the amygdala, yes. Vague, unarticulated discomfort registers as an infinite, ambiguous threat. The amygdala cannot formulate a defense against an unknown variable, so it initiates a systemic, maximal stress response, just in case.
So affect labeling fundamentally alters the threat architecture.
It does. Categorizing the feeling as frustration over a delayed flight applies boundaries to the ambiguity. It converts an infinite threat into a localized, predictable data point.
It's like turning on the lights in a dark, scary room.
That's a really good analogy.
In total darkness, the lack of visual data forces the amygdala to treat every single shadow as a lethal threat. The physiological arousal is massive because anything could be hiding there.
Ex
But flipping the light switch, which is the attic labeling, doesn't actually alter the physical contents of the room. The environment is identical.
right.
But the elimination of ambiguity allows your nervous system to reclassify those scary shadows as just inanimate furniture.
And the arousal state immediately drops. The threat is contextualized, permitting the nervous system to finally stand down.
That makes total sense. But of course, the sources introduce a critical physiological constraint regarding how long this relief actually lasts.
Right, we have to examine the post-labeling spiral, because the brain doesn't just permanently power down after a successful label.
If only it did. So what happens next?
Well, neurophysiologists propose that a single respiratory cycle, meaning one complete inhalation and exhalation, functions as the central nervous system's minimal time unit for behavioral decision-making.
Wait, so the refresh rate of human cognition is tied to one breath cycle.
Yes, the brain acquires data, processes a decision, and prepares for the subsequent environmental input, all within the span of one breath.
Okay, so consequence of that.
Yeah.
The moment you suppress the amygdala on the inhale, by labeling the emotion, the brain immediately resets to evaluate the new baseline.
Exactly. And what the research shows is that post-labeling, new uncategorized emotions instantly emerge.
Oh, man. So if I label my fear of a presentation and my amygdala drops 50% in the very next microsecond, I might experience shame for feeling afraid in the first place.
Or resentment toward the audience for judging you.
Yes.
The cognitive landscape is continuously shifting.
If a new emotion pops up immediately, aren't we just stuck in an endless loop of labeling?
That's the danger. If you attempt to continuously label every new emotion that surfaces with every subsequent breath, you trap yourself in an endless processing loop.
You're just constantly scanning and labeling without ever moving forward.
Right, you remain in a state of high cognitive load without ever achieving resolution.
Which means inhale labeling is strictly an input mechanism. It's step one. But if the brain resets every breath cycle, how do we transition out of the processing phase before the next wave of anxiety hits?
This is where we must utilize the physical consequences of the deep inhalation we just performed. We use it to permanently alter the cognitive environment.
And this brings us into the realm of embodied cognition, right?
Yes, exactly. Embodied cognition.
Which is this fascinating bidirectional relationship between biomechanics and psychology. Like, obviously, the mind governs the body, but postural mechanics exert an aggressive top-down influence on neural processing, too.
They absolutely do. Let's analyze the structural mechanics of a maximal nasal inhalation.
Okay.
Drawing a large volume of air into the lungs mandates skeletal expansion. The rib cage elevates, the thoracic spine extends, and your shoulders naturally retract.
It's literally biomechanically impossible to achieve maximum tidal volume while maintaining a kyphotic slumped posture. You have to sit up straight to breathe deeply.
Right, and the research indicates that a slumped posture is neurologically toxic when you're trying to process stress.
Toxic how? Like it just makes you feel worse.
Much worse. The sources detail the phenomenon of depressive memory bias.
Depressive memory bias.
Empirical studies confirm that a collapsed physical posture, head forward, chest depressed, generates biofeedback that primes the brain for negative recall.
So the physical geometry of your body actively sabotages the brain's search function.
Yes. The nervous system interprets that collapsed posture as a state of defeat or submission, and a hippocampus aligns its retrieval algorithms accordingly.
Wow, so because you're slumped over, it becomes significantly easier to access memories of failure or isolation and regret.
Exactly. Conversely, the forced upright posture initiated by the deep inhale engages your anti-gravity musculature.
The anti-gravity muscles, that sounds sci-fi.
It's just the erector spinae and your core stabilizers that maintain vertical alignment against gravitational pull, but activating those anti-gravity muscles initiates a serotonergic response.
It releases serotonin just from sitting up.
Yes, it mechanically disrupts the depressive memory bias, providing neurochemical protection for your self-esteem. The upright posture effectively rewires the hippocampal search algorithm.
So sitting up straight while breathing in drastically accelerates the retrieval of positive episodic memories.
You are manipulating your neurochemistry simply by expanding the thoracic cavity.
That is such a huge hack. But posture is only one half of the embodied cognition framework here. We also have to look at what the head and eyes are doing.
Right, we have to examine the kinematics of the head and eyes, specifically the concept of perceptual decoupling.
Okay, so when I take that deep nasal inhalation, it naturally induces slight cervical extension. meaning my head tilts upward.
Exactly. It typically elevates the gaze 10 to 30 degrees above the horizon.
And what does that upward deviation do?
It triggers what cognitive psychologists refer to as gaze aversion.
Gaze aversion, like when you avoid making eye contact with someone.
Exactly. In social contexts, averting the gaze is often misinterpreted as submission or shiftiness. But in cognitive science, it is recognized as a vital mechanism for managing computational load.
Because affect labeling requires immense executive function, right?
Yeah. It does. To execute it effectively, the brain must aggressively filter out extraneous environmental data.
Environmental data like
Mm-hmm.
the complex microexpressions on other people's faces, or just the chaotic movement in a busy room.
Both. Individuals with high trait anxiety suffer from a documented deficit in managing visual working memory, or VWM.
Meaning they get visually overwhelmed easily.
Yes. They compulsively allocate their VWM resources to environmental scanning. They are perpetually searching for external threats, even when they're attempting internal introspection.
So they're trying to look inward, but their eyes are frantically scanning the room for danger, which exhausts the prefrontal cortex.
Exactly. But by elevating the gaze 10 to 30 degrees, you force your visual field onto a blank ceiling or an empty sky.
You sever the optical feed of environmental noise.
Yes. This is perceptual decoupling. You uncouple your cognitive processing from external visual stimuli.
It's the equivalent of putting on heavy-duty noise-canceling headphones, but for your eyes.
That is exactly what it is. This upward gaze functions as a neurological circuit breaker, shifting the brain entirely into internal attention mode.
So it quarantines your computational bandwidth, ensuring that the prefrontal cortex has the uninterrupted resources necessary to execute the affect labeling.
Precisely. The posture prevents the depressive memory bias, the upward gaze preserves visual working memory, and the label suppresses the amygdala.
The processing phase is flawlessly optimized,
It is.
but the respiratory cycle still demands an exhale. How do we execute the exhalation without triggering that post-labeling spiral we talked about earlier? We don't want a new wave of anxiety to hit as soon as we breathe out.
Right. So the exhale requires a shift from input to output. The brainstem houses the central pattern generator, or the CPG.
The CPG, what does that do?
It governs rhythmic motor behaviors. From an evolutionary perspective, the CPG synchronizes physical exertion and execution with the exhalation phase.
Think about it: striking a target, lifting a heavy load, vocalizing a command. All those biomechanics of intent and action are inextricably linked to pushing air out of the lungs.
Right. If the inhale is optimized for data acquisition and evaluation, the exhale is biologically engineered for execution.
So what's the actual execution here?
The sources integrate a protocol from cognitive behavioral therapy known as the integrated coping response.
Transitioning the cognitive resolution, the label we just made, into a physical motor output.
Exactly. You have labeled the threat and suppressed the amygdala on the inhale. As the respiratory rhythm shifts to the exhale, you must pair the outgoing breath with a definitive, positive physical action.
What kind of action?
It could involve a conscious, deliberate relaxation of your trapezius muscles in your shoulders, a forward shift in visual focus, or a subtle, affirming physical gesture like a fist pump.
So we're translating the mental resolution into a somatic signal. We're telling the body it's done.
Yes. Executing a positive motor command on the exhale transmits a powerful signal of self-efficacy back through the central nervous system.
It serves as a biological timestamp that the threat processing is complete.
And that preempts the brain's tendency to search for a new anxiety trigger. It effectively closes the loop on the post-labeling spiral.
But the sources don't just recommend any generalized physical action. They prescribe a highly specific and frankly kind of counterintuitive facial motor routine for the exhalation.
They do. They require the deliberate contraction of the zygomaticus major muscle.
Meaning raising the corners of her mouth into a smile.
Right. Paired with the maximum widening of the palpebral fissures.
Which means opening the eyes as wide as possible, so you're smiling and wide-eyed on the exhale. From an external perspective, I've got to be honest, that sounds uncomfortably close to the toxic positivity trope of just smile through the pain.
I completely understand why it sounds that way.
Right. Especially given the replication crisis that plagued early facial feedback studies back in the 1980s. I imagine many listeners are highly skeptical of the claim that faking a smile alters brain chemistry.
The skepticism is absolutely warranted when discussing those early underpowered studies. However, the sources we are looking at rely on the 2022 many smiles collaboration.
This was a much bigger deal, right?
Oh, this was not a localized small sample experiment. It was a rigorous cross-cultural study involving nearly 4,000 participants across 19 countries.
4,000 people.
Yes, it was specifically designed with massive statistical power to definitively resolve the facial feedback debate once and for all.
They implemented strict controls to differentiate between actual emotional shifts and participants merely guessing the experiment's intent, right?
They did, and the data from those 4,000 subjects was unequivocal.
What did it show?
The methodology proved that the mechanical contraction of the zygomaticus major muscle initiates a profound physiological cascade, completely independent of the subject's baseline emotional state.
So the muscle contraction itself is the trigger, not the feeling behind it. It doesn't matter if the smile is fake.
Exactly. It does not matter. When you pull the corners of the mouth toward the ears, mechanoreceptors transmit a robust signal via the trigeminal nerve directly into the brainstem.
The trigeminal nerve.
Yes. This physical input forces the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system. It actively antagonizes and suppresses the sympathetic tone we were talking about earlier.
So the trigeminal nerve basically acts as a manual override switch for the autonomic nervous system.
It mechanically induces a drop in blood pressure and a deceleration of heart rate.
Wow.
But the cognitive effects are even more significant than the cardiovascular ones.
How so?
Acute anxiety induces cognitive narrowing. It's a tunneling of attention that restricts your focus solely to the immediate threat, completely eliminating creative problem-solving capabilities.
Right. The brain sacrifices lateral thinking for survival focus. You get tunnel vision.
Exactly. The trigeminal feedback from the zygomaticus contraction, the smile, effectively shatters that tunnel vision.
Just by contracting the muscle.
Yes. It signals the brain to widen its cognitive scope, instantly reestablishing the neural conditions necessary for flexible lateral thinking. You are mechanically rebooting the cognitive environment.
We are operating entirely as biological machines here. It isn't a matter of adopting a positive mindset. It is the blunt, mechanical application of trigeminal nerve stimulation to forcefully boot up the parasympathetic nervous system.
That's exactly what it is. Which brings us to the final mechanical lever, opening the eyes wide on the exhale.
Right, the widening of the palpebral fissures. Why is that so important?
Well, we previously discussed how anxiety and depression manifest in slumped posture. They also dictate facial kinematics.
The physiological posture of distress.
Right. It involves squinting, furrowed brows, and a lowered gaze. It is a biological stance of avoidance and withdrawal, shielding the visual system from a hostile environment.
It's a defensive contraction of the facial muscles. You're bracing for impact.
Exactly. By consciously overriding that default, by forcefully widening the eyes during the exhalation, you flood the visual system with light and peripheral data.
And what does that data influx do?
This massive influx of sensory stimulation hits the ascending reticular activating system, or the ARIS, located in the brainstem.
The ARIS, that's the system that regulates the brain's global state of arousal and wakefulness, right?
Yes. Surging the ARS with this visual data drives a wave of activation up into the frontal lobes. It aggressively shifts the brain's global state from avoidance motivation, the desire to retreat and isolate, into approach motivation.
Approach motivation. That prepares the organism to engage with its environment, seek rewards, and tackle challenges.
Exactly. The kinematics of confidence and readiness are universally expansive. An open chest and wide, alert eyes.
By mechanically forcing the eyes wide, you terminate the internal rumination cycle. You generate a biological propulsion that forces the brain out of defensive processing and into a state of alert, creative readiness.
The entire breath cycle becomes a complete system override. We optimize the input on the inhale, and we manually trigger approach motivation on the exhale.
It's an incredibly precise sequence. But while a single application of this protocol neutralizes an immediate stressor, the true value detailed in the sources lies in the long-term neuroplasticity.
The long-term effects are really the end game here.
We have to examine what happens to the brain's architecture when this sequence becomes a habitual response.
To understand the long-term rewiring, we have to examine a specific neural highway deep within the brainstem. It connects two critical nodes, the pre-Butzinger complex and the locus coeruleus.
Let's break those down. The pre-Butzinger complex, or pre-Buxi, functions as the central metronome for respiration, right?
Yes. It dictates the rhythm, the depth, and the cadence of the breath cycle.
And the locus coeruleus is the principal site for the synthesis of noradrenaline in the brain.
Right. It is the command center responsible for regulating global arousal, panic, and the systemic stress response.
So the locus coeruleus is basically the neurochemical engine of anxiety.
It is. Now, the critical discovery here is the direct, robust neural projection from the pre-Buxi respiratory clock to the locus coeruleus panic center.
They're hardwired together.
Yes. When an individual operates with a chronic baseline of shallow, restricted upper chest breathing, which frankly is endemic in modern populations, the pre-Buxi continuously transmits rapid, erratic electrical signals along that highway.
So the respiratory metronome is constantly informing the panic center that the organism is under threat. It causes a continuous leak of noradrenaline into the brain.
Exactly. The baseline state becomes one of chronic, low-grade panic, dictated entirely by default breathing mechanics.
That is terrifying. Just breathing poorly keeps you in a state of low-grade panic all day.
It does. However, when you systematically apply the inhale labeling protocol, the controlled nasal inhalation, the postural expansion, the precise exhalation, you send a rhythmic, modulated bottom-up signal along that exact same neural pathway.
Reversing the signal.
Yes, the slow, controlled respiratory data from the pre-Buxi aggressively inhibits the locus coeruleus, effectively shutting off the noradrenaline drip.
So the short-term application silences the panic center right in the moment. But the long-term application fundamentally alters the brain's sensitivity to internal data.
It does, through the enhancement of interoception.
Interoception. This is a crucial concept. Let's define it for the listener.
Interoception is the nervous system's capacity to perceive and monitor its own internal physiological condition.
Like your heart rate, your respiratory cadence, muscular tension, even your gastrointestinal state.
Right. It's the brain's internal telemetry system. Now, individuals experiencing chronic stress typically exhibit severely blunted interoception.
Meaning they don't notice what's happening inside their own bodies.
Exactly. They are largely oblivious to their physiological escalation until the sympathetic arousal is overwhelming. They don't realize they are stressed until they are experiencing a full autonomic cascade.
A full-blown panic attack.
Yes, but the rigid step-by-step nature of the inhale labeling protocol forces the brain to continuously monitor its internal telemetry.
Because you cannot execute the steps without paying hyper-specific attention to your diaphragm, your nasal airflow, and your facial musculature.
Precisely. This continuous practice rapidly sharpens your interoceptive acuity. The brain becomes incredibly adept at detecting minute shifts in your physiological baseline.
So you begin to identify the absolute earliest precursors of sympathetic arousal.
Yes, like a fractional tightening of the intercostal muscles in your ribs, or a subtle shift in jaw tension.
Which allows for the application of what the literature terms the stop-sigh switch method.
Right. Because your interoceptive radar is so finely tuned, you detect the stress response at its absolute inception.
You stop the cognitive rumination immediately. You initiate the deep nasal sigh to synchronize the LFPs and label the affect. And you switch the biomechanical posture, elevating the gaze and widening the eyes on the exhale.
You neutralize the physiological cascade before it gathers any momentum. And through the principles of Hebbian learning.
Neurons that fire together, wire together.
Exactly. This repeated execution drives massive neuroplasticity. Every time the prefrontal cortex successfully suppresses the amygdala during the labeling phase, the synaptic connections between those two structures undergo long-term potentiation.
Long-term potentiation. So the brain aggressively myelinates that specific neural pathway, increasing the speed and efficiency of the suppression signal.
Yes. You are structurally fortifying the physical connection between your executive login center and your primitive threat center.
You are literally building a thicker cable between the brakes and the engine.
That is exactly what you are doing. The behavioral outcome, as explicitly guaranteed by the longitudinal data in the sources, is not merely transient stress relief.
It's permanent.
The structural enhancement of that functional connectivity results in an elevated baseline of stress tolerance and a permanently stabilized capacity for autonomic self-regulation.
It is a biologically inevitable adaptation to the protocol. If you do the work, the brain has to change.
It has no choice.
That is just phenomenal. So to synthesize this immense physiological roadmap we've just covered, the moment you detect murky anxiety, immediately cease subvocalizing on the exhale, as it restricts tidal volume and triggers hypercapnic panic in the brainstem.
Right, don't trap yourself on the exhale.
Instead, transition to a deep nasal inhalation. This engages the olfactory bulb to broadcast local field potentials, synchronizing your amygdala and hippocampus to optimize the sensory sampling window.
Perfect. And within that optimized window, apply an affect label to the emotion.
Name it to tame it. This engages the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex to transmit a suppression order to the amygdala, instantly having its threat response by resolving the ambiguity of the stressor.
And simultaneously, allow that maximal inhalation to mechanically expand your thoracic spine and engage the anti-gravity musculature, which blocks the depressive memory bias.
Right. Sit up straight. Elevate your gaze 10 to 30 degrees to initiate perceptual decoupling, shielding your visual working memory from environmental noise. Look up.
And finally, to prevent the post-labeling spiral during the subsequent respiratory cycle, transition into the output phase on the exhale.
The action phase. Mechanically contract the zygomaticus major smile to stimulate the trigeminal nerve and boot up the parasympathetic nervous system. And aggressively widen the eyes to surge the ARS, shifting the global brain state into approach motivation.
You've got it. That's the entire sequence.
In an environment defined by relentless digital stimulation, cognitive overload, and chronic sympathetic arousal, your respiratory mechanics serve as the ultimate somatic override. You possess the biological capacity to reach directly into your brainstem and fundamentally rewrite the code of your autonomic nervous system,
It is the most accessible and potent biological lever available to you for emotional regulation.
which leads to a final, highly provocative implication that builds directly on the mechanics we've explored today. Consider the modern baseline of human biomechanics. Consider the posture we adopt for hours every single day while interacting with technology.
The smartphone posture, it is universally collapsed.
The cervical spine is flexed, the thoracic cavity is depressed, and respiration is shallow. We are slumped over, staring down at our phones, severely restricting our tidal volume.
And our facial musculature is entirely slack, and our palpebral fissures are narrowed as we focus on a small screen.
We're squinting and slouching. If we map that default technological posture against the hard science we just unpacked, it is the exact biomechanical inverse of the inhale labeling protocol.
It perfectly satisfies every single physical trigger for depressive memory bias, perceptual narrowing, and chronic locus coeruleus activation.
Our default physical interface with our devices is a master blueprint for sympathetic nervous system panic.
It really is.
So, the next time you reach for your phone, evaluate your biomechanics. Is your posture biologically programming your brainstem for acute anxiety before you even process a single notification? We will leave you to explore that thought.